Good afternoon. Welcome to today's Tech Talk. For CME credit, you must sign in and you must include your email and credentials. Some upcoming talks sponsored by the Delaware CTR. November 9th, the ID series will have Dr. Lee Patchter from the Moors talking about racism, adversity, and child health. And on December 6th, there'll be a tech talk from Zugwei Zhang.
Oh, no.
No?
Oh,
It's been
Ramat.
changed?
Yeah, she's been changed. Ramat.
I thought this was the latest. Ramat?
Ramat. I don't remember his name.
Okay.
Yeah.
For the talks, please register. It helps us prepare. And the full schedule of talks is posted on the Delaware CTR website. The speaker today is Dr. Joe Yčas. Dr. Yčas got his PhD at Cornell. He has several master's degrees. He has a strong background in both biostatistics and biology. He worked at DuPont for about 14 years when DuPont was collaborating with Merck and then with Bristol Myers Squibb in pharmaceuticals. He started as a biostatistician on early phase clinical trials. And later he headed up a programming group, and at the end he was in quality control and manufacturing. That understates all the different areas that he worked. He's worked in a lot in the pharmaceutical area. After that, he worked at AstraZeneca, where I met him. I worked with Joe for over 10 years at AstraZeneca, and most of our work was in late phase clinical trials. Joe could do standard statistical analysis, but the way he approached exploring data was a little different, was creative, but was doing some things I wouldn't have thought. I think one of his more important contributions was with Plato's study, where he was the lead statistician, and beyond ensuring the quality of the data and doing the regular statistical analysis, I think the exploration that he did of the data was critical to the approval of Pathome. Today's talk is exploring the human pathome using real-world data. So please welcome Dr. Joe Yčas.
Well, thank you very much. I tried to prepare thoroughly for you, but there is one thing I forgot, and that's I forgot to review the CME questions that I said you should be able to answer. I hope I bring up the answers to those questions, and if not, don't hesitate to call. I want to thank Rick and Dina, of course, for her work getting me here and for you guys coming. I want to kind of tell sort of a story today, and it's a story about how something happened, a finding arose, which needed a solution, and then the solution in turn brought us into contact with a rather odd question that actually has been kicking around for better than a century. And then looking into that in turn led to developing a kind of a new way of looking at data, which was new to me, and so far as I know, it's kind of new in general, which I would call pathomics. Okay, well, let's get started here. The unexpected finding was there was a pharmaceutical trial, a very large trial. And when the data was unblinded, lo and behold, certainly unexpectedly, there was an imbalance in a certain bad thing. And the imbalance was against the drug. There were more events on the drug. This, of course, immediately triggered a tremendous amount of investigation and looking hard at the data. And in the course of that, one of the things you look at just to see if it gives you any hint of what's going on is whether this effect is concentrated in some particular subgroup of patients. So what you do is which subgroup do you want? Well, you look at all the subgroups. You look at subgroups by medical history and subgroups by age, gender, subgroups by laboratories. And then you get a p-value for the interaction of subgroup by drug and throw them against the wall and see which one makes the biggest splat. And the one that made the biggest splat, really by far, was dividing patients by whether the RDW laboratory value was below the lab upper limit of normal or above it. Now, this was very interesting for a couple of reasons. When you do subgroups, of course, each subgroup has a slightly different ratio, because by chance they're not the same. So quantitative differences, you see that. But actually what we had here was a qualitative difference, that the effect was extremely negative in this here, and actually went a little bit the other way. Really, it was the same, but it looked in effect, it was the same, but it actually edged up a little more in the other direction. And even more remarkably, this was the smaller subgroup of the two. So that kind of concentration does get your attention. But the other thing that really struck me about this was I had, as Rick says, been plowing through clinical trials for really quite a long time. I had never heard of RDW. And in fact, when you asked clinicians, they seemed a little vague about it. And when they did tell you, mention it, you got the impression that they weren't sure that serious people should be talking about RDW. So this struck me as all very interesting, and I thought I would look a little more deeply into it. Well, what is RDW? RDW is an acronym for red cell distribution width, except they dropped out the C for reasons we shall see. And what it is you take a suspension of red blood cells and you measure the volumes of a whole bunch of them, actually thousands of them, electronically. Get a column of numbers, and then you take what's called the average, it's a statistical term here, and you relabel it the MCV, the mean corpuscular volume. Then, and this is, of course, not done by you, actually. It's done by a hematological instrument, analyzer. You put it in, and it does all those differentials and white blood cells and hemoglobins in 40 seconds. And what's the $30 bill or something comes out the other end. But it also then calculates the standard deviation. And then you divide the standard deviation by the mean, and you get a number. You multiply it by 100 to get a percent. And that's the RDW. Okay. So this raises some questions. First of all, what is a statistic doing on a laboratory report anyway? This is like the only one. Secondly, why has nobody heard of it? And then if you start asking clinicians, when do you consult RDW? They all get, kind of vague and look at their shoes and say, there's something about differentiating microcytic anemias, I think. Basically, it's out there, but people are very unfamiliar with it. How did it get there? Why is it there? Well, there's an answer to every question. And it all starts with Louis-Charles Malasset, who in 1889 published a short article in the Compte Rendu. He was a physician in Paris who was well known for developing an advanced hemocytometer, and this paper is forgotten, but he is known forever because Malassezia, skin fungus, is named. You take what you can get. He for the first time measured the distribution of the sizes of the red blood cells, of the diameters. He got the microscope and used like a camera lucida or something, and he drew pictures and he measured them, and he did 100 red blood cells in 3 samples. First one was a normal adult. I'm not sure, but I think his first name was Louis Charles. The second one was a young lady with a disease called chlorosis, which its exact identity is now becoming hard to tell. And the third one was fetal blood. And as you can see, he totaled them up here. And you can see that the normal adult had somewhat smaller cells than the chlorosis case. And then you also had even larger fetal cells, but also a greater spread. Now, he mentions here that, these data would be easier to really see if you drew them as a distribution curve, or even, he says, what if you made columns of different heights to basically a histogram? The histogram was invented by Carl Pearson 6 years later. So he's ahead of his time. He didn't publish, of course, these curves because back then scientific journals only published ratings, not line feet. Okay, so what impact did Louis Charles have? Absolutely none. Everybody forgot about it. Only 2 people ever cited them, and one of them is in this room. The other one is Cecil Price Jones, who's a fascinating character. He was the son of a rather well-to-do a physician in suburban London, born in 1863. He was groomed by his father to take over the surgery, and he studied at the University of London and got his MBA from Guy's Hospital in 1889. And that's really an important date because by this time, this is the end of the old medicine, and the new scientific medicine with measurements, and particularly with use of the microscope, has really, it's already taken off in Europe, with Pasteur and Koch and so forth, but it's sort of in England's a little behind thing. So he kind of managed to get educated right before he could learn it. Well, he got his degree in spring of 1889. His father, who apparently was very domineering, got him to work with him, but then in the fall, his father died. He took over the place. They lived in the surgery. He lived with his mother and sisters. The sisters got married off. He married the girl next door. At the age of 20, she was. 2 years later, she complained of stomach ailment. That evening, she died of intestinal obstruction. So at this point, things get very vague with what Cecil's doing. But then around 1900, he has metamorphosized himself into becoming a pathologist. At the age of 37, he joins the Pathological Society. And so far as we can tell, he did this in an unpaid capacity. He seems to have been well-to-do. He owned a 49-ton yacht. So in 1905, he gets his first grant application to the British Medical Association to do work. He asks for 20 pounds sterling. It's like $1,000 now. And this is his grant application. They were a little different than they are now. It says, comparative psychology of the blood with a view to determining the value, if any, of blood examinations in the prognosis of disease, which is basically what this talk is about today. Well, 1905, what happens to his grant? He does publish a little bit. Things are slowed down because he gets an infection from the laboratory cultures and almost dies. Then he joins the Royal Army Medical Corps in World War I and runs the pathology laboratory in a general hospital. But finally, in 1920, 15 years later, he is able to publish a paper on the variation of red blood cell sizes in individual persons, not just differences between people. And this is where he introduces the use of the coefficient of variation, which he gets out of a textbook. So far as we can tell, this textbook, originally written in 1911, is the last time a statistician had anything to do with the RDW. So he becomes very well known for his work. And they talk about the Price-Jones curve, which are these curves, which are actually what Wallace is doing. The way they're done is you get a microscope, you put a sample in. Anybody ever used a camera lucida? You look in and there's like a split image, and so you see things on the microscope stage, but you can also see what's on a sheet of paper next to you, and you can trace them with a pencil. You trace 500 blood cells, you measure the minimum and maximum size, you take the average, and you compile them, and you get a column of numbers. And then you can plot them out, and actually there's a very dramatic effect on red blood cell size in pernicious anemia, and that was a really big deal because in 1920, pernicious anemia was a death sentence, 1 or 2 years, but during that decade, the liver treatment was discovered in Boston, and it was a very big news that medicine actually was now able to treat serious fatal disease, especially if you could correctly diagnose it. So he showed that the diagnosis was tied to these very abnormal blood distribution. That's before liver treatment. That's after. But although there was kind of a vogue for the Price-Jones curve, 30s, 40s, 50s, and then interest kind of faded out. And there are a couple reasons for this. One of which is just the computation of a standard deviation is challenging when all you have are pencil, paper, or maybe later on mechanical calculators. The other one is collecting this data is really a pain. Takes probably 2 or 3 hours of very difficult microscope work to do it. There are only so many residents that you can call upon to do the work for you. And when they get older and more senior, they hate the thing so much they don't ever want to see it again. And so it kind of faded away. But the measurement issue was essentially solved by Wallace Coulter. Wallace Coulter was an itinerant electronics technician who in 1949 came up with the idea of measuring blood cells by having a suspension pass through a very narrow orifice and then having an electronic detector which measured the change in impedance. The change in impedance is directly proportional to the volume of the cell, so it automatically comes out. So Wallace went to his patent attorney, and his patent attorney looked at this and said, you know, Wallace, this is very ingenious, but you can't patent a hole. So Wallace went back to his garage, and he said, there's something I need that I just don't have. And he figured out there was a better patent attorney. And he went on, this is the Coulter, he got a patent, this became the Coulter counter, and then you know Coulter Corporation and Beckman Coulter all come. But look at what this does. He says the device counts in excess of 6,000 cells a second, rather than 500 in half a day under the microscope method. So now there's tons of data, but there's really no way to deal with it in the 1950s. No. So what happened was the Coulter counter began to evolve to what it is today, a fully functional hemocytometry, hematological analyzer. And in 1979, out came the Coulter Model S, which used some kind of analog circuit that kind of measured something like the distance between the 20th percent and the 80th percent. And then if you take that number and you multiply it by 0.66, it kind of comes out to be 10, and let's call it the red distribution width. I don't know who was behind this, but clearly they were mildly confused. But this is where RDW comes from I think, from the manual of this instrument. Then in 1984, they said, you know, I think by now they were getting like electronics with like calculator stuff. They said, we can actually give you the CV, but they didn't change the name to the corpuscular CV. They just called it RDW, and here it is today. So it basically arose as a feature, which very few people understood why it was there. And then for the next 25 years, there were about 10 papers a year came out, and about 5 of them would say, this might be useful in the differentiation of certain microcytic anemias, and 5 would say, we're not so sure about that. And it kind of went back and forth, and people paid very, very little attention to it. It was just every other company, though, that made instruments added it too, because Coulter was the industry leader, and it's a feature, and it's just software change, so it's easy to incorporate. Until 2007, this is when the CHARM study was analyzed. This is a study in heart failure patients. It was actually run out of Fairfax here in Delaware. And there was a statistician, Stuart Pocock, was on it. And they, I guess, had a little extra time and thought they would just go through the exercise of seeing what factors at randomization were prognostic of patients dying later on. This is just averaging all of the placebo treatment and so forth together. It's an extremely complicated treatment, actually. And what they found, to everyone's surprise, was the patients with the higher RDWs had a higher mortality risk, and this could not be explained by any known factor at that time. And the result you can see in the number of publications with RDW was dramatic. So our problem should be solved, because since 2007, there have been over 1,000 publications. So surely we understand how RDW arises, because surely people have done bench studies, they have done laboratory animal studies, healthy volunteer studies, and all this kind of thing, except nobody has done anything like that. All they do over and over again are sort of cookie cutter epidemiological risk types of studies that were done in the CHARM studies. However, they do them in different disease populations. So maybe if RDW itself can't really tell us what it's all about, maybe if we just look at the diseases that are involved, we can kind of put the puzzle together from those pieces. And surely there are plenty of diseases. There's celiac disease and carbon monoxide poisoning, sleep apnea, idiopathic, on and on. There are plenty of them. So can't we put these all together? Well, the answer is not really. The reason why we can't is because these studies are just don't tell us what we need to know. First of all, they're directed studies. They're saying, I'm going to study something that I want to study. So it's like having a flashlight and saying, I'm going to look over there. Of course, everybody likes to use different methodologies. That's, but the statistician used other people's methodology. Why hire them? So we'll do some more stuff. I hate to say this, but some of the studies have marginal statistical power. And this creates difficulties in, is this really, this result as strong as this one? And then you get into meta-analysis, meta-analysis. There's the one disease at a time paradigm, because medicine is specialized. So each person has usually a specific disease focus. So we look at one disease at a time. And then we have publication bias, which is to say if the result's not significant, well, maybe you want to publish it, but good luck. No one's going to publish it for you. So this actually creates two problems. There's the one problem everybody talks about, which is the relation of type 1 error. If there's really nothing going on, you do 20 consecutive studies, one of them will get a p-value of less than 0.05. Oh, it's too far, isn't it? Is less than 0.05, and yes, but that result is really a false positive and it's misleading. But actually, the situation here is a little different. There are actually lots of real effects with RDW. So let's say out of 20 things, 10 of them have a real association. So you do 20 studies and you get 10 positive and 10 negative, but you don't publish the negative ones. So all that you see is a wall of all of these positive results. And clinicians look at that and they say, but this is a totally non-specific effect. It's just everywhere. So they start saying, I think it's due to inflammation or stress. It could be due to stress or low physiological reserve, or it's a barometer of poor health. And then with these causes, but basically they walk away because if it's not specific, how can it help guide their treatment? So, but if you had published the other 10 that were negative, they might be able to see a pattern there and begin to make some progress. So what is to be done? The Pathome-wide analysis scan. Heard of the genome-wide analysis scan? The PWAS, well, this is the same kind of idea. Used to be in genetic studies, we looked at a gene. Now we look at the genome end to end. So what you want to do is examine the full disease spectrum using a consistent methodology throughout. You want to adequately power every single disease you look at. You want to provide a synoptic bird's eye view of the big picture so that you can use the pattern recognition capability, which is built into our retinas. And you want to be undirected. It shouldn't be based upon hunches or guesses or hypotheses that people have. Where do those come from? They have to come from looking at data to begin with. And this is where you would start. But there's one constraint you have to work on. And that constraint is that RDW is free to everybody because everybody gets CBCs. They're always there. And that sounds great in terms of medical economics, but it also introduces this idea of the tragedy of the commons. If everybody gets it for free, nobody's benefiting from it specifically. So who's going to fund it? Who's going to give you money? Nobody in the private sector. And if you were to go to NIH and look them in the eye and say, I want to study the bigness of the most common blood cell, the most common cell in the human body in relation to everything, I think they would say to you, Wallace, you can't patent a whole. So the one more constraint is that you need to do this on a shoestring. So how do you do it? Well, claims data. Every claim, we have a wonderful system in the United States in terms of generating data. And that is that every medical encounter has to be paid for through insurance claims, and the insurance claims have to contain diagnosis codes. I'm looking at claims data from 2007 to 2013, so these are ICD-9. And there's an outfit which we raised the shade, we could see them. They're down on the waterfront called Health Corps, which is then part of the Anthem system. And they have been doing all this nasty work, collating and putting together all of the different data and getting unique identifiers even for patients who move between jobs and all that kind of thing. And at that time, they had 33 million insured lives. They also collect all the labs, all the outpatient labs, all the LabCorp and Quest labs. And they had, so 20% of those patients had some CBCs, complete blood counts. And anyway, you get down to certain criteria I have, and you're talking about still over 2 million patients for which you have a CBC, which is preceded by a full year. So you can look to see if they have certain, regular, for example, diabetes and so forth. You would certainly see a claim earlier if they had that. Whether it's really free or not depends on who you ask, but it was certainly free to me. So we're going to use this to look at the pathome to try to understand RDW. But you could do this for plenty of other things. RDW here is just an example. So we're going to look at diseases past, what I call the chronic disease pathome, which is asking the question, what persistent or recurrent conditions are associated with an elevated RDW, which is basically more than 14.5% of the mean, as it were. And the method is just to try to flag patients by whether for one specific diagnosis they have at least two medical encounters widely spaced in time in the previous year and a half. So you figure you're going to pick up high blood pressure, you're going to pick up diabetes or COPD. It has to, of course, be a condition which brings people to a medical encounter. And then we look at so we say, okay, you had it or not, and then we're going to pick this index CBC and ask, were you high or low, and then do stepwise logistic regression, put in some explanatory variables, some other MCV and hemoglobin off of the same CBC, age, sex, and there's really almost no other patient identifying information. This is very anonymized, so the only thing we have is what their claims were. And then the stepwise elimination end up with 99 codes with a Bonferroni adjusted p-value of about 0.05 if they show up at all. And there it is. So what does this tell us? Well, I'm afraid this is not a big victory for pattern recognition because it looks like the stuff scattered all over the place. The most you can really say is that this is no effect here, no association. There are a lot more things that are associated with high RDW than they're positively associated with it. There aren't many diseases that are associated not having a high value. Kind of hard to understand what that means, but the truth is it doesn't mean very much. But you do see there are a few high flyers here, which is kind of interesting. And if you were to stare at all of these for a very long time, you would notice that 10 of these very high numbers are autoimmune disorders. Some very common ones like rheumatoid arthritis or psoriasis, some kind of scarce ones like bullous dermatosis and polyarteritis nodosa. But these are all autoimmune conditions. They seem to be associated with that. So, not a big help in figuring out what is truly going on. If you have the disease, even after adjustment for all the other chronic diseases, and your age, and your sex, and your hemoglobin and MCV, you still have twice as high a chance of having an elevated RDW, if you will. That makes sense?
But wouldn't there be a collinearity between MCV and RDW? Because isn't it kind of
Yes,
thing?
there could be. But in general, when people do these epidemiologic studies and show a relationship between poor prognosis and RDW, it is statistically independent of MCV. It's showing you something different. And I could explain kind of probably why that is, but that would lead us past our time slot here. But if we have time, okay, let's try something else. Let's try diseases present. We're going to ask, are there emergent conditions that are associated with an acute increase in RD? This is the difference. So if you get something, does what things make your RDW go up? It's actually a little closer to a clinical trial or something where you do something to the patient, except the thing we're doing to them is they get a disease on their own. And the way I do it is, this is about the sloppiest analysis I've ever done, is you find the first day 0 in here, that a patient gets a condition they haven't had in the previous year. Say it's a new onset. And then you look to see if by any chance they have CBCs around them, outpatient CBCs. They're almost certainly unrelated to having the condition. It's just sort of happenstance if you pick people up. But with 2 million people, it's amazing. You do find these cases. And then we kind of squinch together the far ends for reasons that we'll see later. And then you take all of that data and you just identify these by RDW and days from index event, from -5 to +50. And you take that data and you just dump it into a big heap and you do a regression of RDW by days elapsed. Do it for one disease, and then you do it for up to 798 diseases, which have met a threshold of having at least 1,250 eligible cases. Don't adjust for concurrent conditions. You don't adjust for the patient characteristics because we're looking for the data for before and after is always evaluated in the same patient. So those should just zero out, and no formal inference. So this is just definitely throwing against the wall. And what do we get? We get a lot more specificity. So here, first of all, let's look at the distribution of slopes for all the diseases. And it's a kind of a normal looking pile centered pretty close to no effect, 0. But then as you go out, it's strongly skewed to the right. There seem to definitely be a bunch of diseases that are strongly associated with RD. There are changes in RDW that are strongly related to certain diseases, in a much different way than the average one. And then when we look at these by body system, we can see musculoskeletal, skin, genitourinary, it's all kind of fluctuating around this 0 line. Same is true of nervous and sensory, benign neoplasms. Infections don't do too much. Mental aren't very different. But and neither are upper respiratory, but lower respiratory, digestive, circulatory, and blood-forming conditions. There's a very strong relationship. So we are seeing considerable specificity in terms of body system, and then even within body systems, if you look carefully, you can see that in circulatory, there's actually several clusters. This is a cluster for venous thrombosis. This is a cluster around heart failure. And I think down here you're getting cardiopulmonary conditions. And then also notice down here, extreme effect for sepsis. No other infections show much of anything, but septicemia, yes.
So here it's the increase in RDW.
Yes. So in fact, you can visualize it here because believe it or not, you just throw all this data together. You bin it by days from index event, and you look at percent of the values in this heap that exceed 14.5, and because there is more than 10,000 patients in each of these categories, you can actually draw these profiles. And as you can see, they look like they're all kind of the same shape, suggesting it's consistent with there being kind of one thing going on rather than several. You see the strongest effect for sepsis and for serious pulmonary conditions here. This is looking at these three things of sepsis, respiratory, and pulmonary. This is pneumonia, which is a combination of like really serious pneumonias, and I have a 1 degree elevate, rise in temperature pneumonia. And then down here is influenza, which did not progress to pneumonia. There's hardly any change. So what we're looking at on this chart really is kind of the slope. And you can see how all of these have a steep slope. We are beginning to see a little specificity. So let's move on to the diseases yet to come. What emergent conditions are predicted by prior RDW? You say I have high RDW, say, well, you might get something to worry about. Does everybody here know their RDW number?
Maybe we should ask this for the next biometric.
Okay. That's not on the quiz. Okay, and this is the way you would typically do it. You find a claim for which there's been no claim for quite a while before, so it's a nuance. No, I'm sorry, yeah. So for a given disease, the patient, you find a CBC for which there was a long interval before when they did not make a claim for it, and then you look at the CBC, you give it a 30-day buffer to be sure that the symptoms of an emergent disease didn't drive them going to get the CBC, and then you follow them out for up to 5 years, average length of 2 years. And I won't go through all the details except to point out that for each, there are 1,400 different disease codes which have at least 1,000 cases to look at. So these are the ones I'm looking at. In each of those, we're going to look at 2 million patients and 4.1 patient years. And every result of greater than 1.2 is necessarily significant at 0.05, which means that if you look at all of them together, there's a 1 in 20 chance that one of them is a false positive. And the runtime on this is extremely long. I had a very powerful server, which other people neglected to use, and it would take about 12 continuous days of running to do this. Again, I think it's cheap, but it didn't cost me anything. And this is what you get. This is future incidence PWAS. Again, you see a similar heap here with a long, actually a little bit of a bimodal thing at the end here. There are 99 diagnoses with a hazard ratio of greater than 1.2 per unit change in RDW. So if RDW if the average is 13 and you're 15, that's 2 times this. It's actually 1.44 hazard ratio. Anyway, be that as it may. This straight vertical line here is no effect. You see a similar distribution as we saw in the acute, where all of these body systems have almost nothing going on. This is mostly skin ulcers. And then down here, again, upper respiratory, no. Lower respiratory, yes. Digestive, yes. Circulatory, again, these 3 groups we talked about. Nothing going on, hardly at all, in nervous and sensory. A whole bunch in mental. Big hit in mental. And then blood forming metabolic. So if those of you in the back want to come forward, you'll see you can't read them from up front. But we can blow it up for you a little bit. So this is the lower respiratory. These are pneumonias. A lot of these are related to COPD. But up here is quite a miscellaneous bunch. We have disorders of the diaphragm, pulmonary insufficiency to trauma surgery, acute edema, idiopathic fibrosis, pleural effusion, pneumonitis, lots of bad things to do with your lungs. And the closer you get to the parenchyma, the more likely you are to have the high RDW. Circulatory, you can see very clearly this cluster around venous thromboembolism and heart failure. These are consequences of stroke. And then down here is the cardiopulmonary diseases. And if we had gone to a lower threshold, we would have picked up another cluster down here of mitral disorders, valvular disorder, endocarditis. And then mental. Now this is an impressive concentration here, where over this whole interval, every single one of these is over this 1.2 threshold. And all of these are substance abuse, alcohol, tobacco, and a wide and miscellaneous bunch of other drugs as well. It's a little hard to interpret because I understand that people who take one of these drugs frequently take a lot of the other ones at the same time. And in particular, smoking is a common factor across drug abuse, as it also is with schizophrenics. I guess almost all of them smoke, and they also get picked up. And down here you have consequences of particularly alcoholism, like withdrawal and delirium. So there is definitely a cluster here. So we're finding some patterns, and I think this begins to give us some sense of what RDW is telling us about the patient. We don't know for sure, but maybe we can start ruling out some things. Because it was first found in heart failure, there's a widespread belief that this had to do was focused on circulatory disorders. But if you look here, I think you can see certainly there's a couple other foci as well. So what's behind the mechanism? Well, there are ways we can play with the data to tell us some things about what's going on or maybe what's not going on. And there's sort of a whole little subdiscipline of examining causality of relationships. And I won't go into the details too much, except to say that there is a way to tell whether there's a situation kind of like A causes B causes C. If you measure all of them, you can kind of figure out whether B really is mediating A and C. And the way you do it is, well, you look at the correlation of C and A and C and B. And of course, C is related to its ultimate cause, and C is even better related to its proximal cause. But if you condition A on B, you're saying, what in A that doesn't get kind of carried through to B is related to C? And the answer is nothing, because it's only it's only the information about A that's kind of getting to B and keeps going. And indeed, you see the correlation evaporates. On the other hand, you can have the so-called collider situation, where A and B are acting on the end of the chain independently. And so A doesn't depend on B or B on C. Again, you see these correlations of A, B, B with D. They look similar. But when you condition A on B, correlation essentially is preserved because B doesn't tell you anything about A. So conditioning on it changes nothing. So we can apply this in which our data points aren't going to be individuals or something. Our data points are going to be diseases. And we can address, and this is sort of just a graphic picture of what happens. If it's a mediator situation, if you plot the correlation with A on a condition for B, it drops from a 1-to-1 line down to practically 0. Whereas if it's not related, then your point is going to be plotted very close to this line of unity. You're all with me here, right? Yes. Well, the important thing is to get results, not what they mean. So I'm going to show you the results. We're going to look at anemia. Of course, anemia is a diagnosis, but in fact, anemia starts before you get the diagnosis, and it actually proceeds. You're normal, you get less normal, you get to be anemic. So that's not really how you want to look at anemia. What you want to look at anemia is something that you can measure even when you don't know the patient has the disease or whatever. And that's basically their hemoglobin, because their hemoglobin is going to be low when they're anemic. It was normal when they were normal, and therefore, by some mathematical thing, it must have moved steadily downward over time. So we can because anemia was originally said to be what RDW was all about. Some people thought, well, maybe the disease causes anemia, which then causes high RDW, and of course causes low hemoglobin. Or maybe there's some kind of undetected anemia, which is causing high RDW, and the anemia is causing disease. In this case, anemia, in both cases, is on the causal pathway. Or it could be a situation where your disease is causing high RDW, anemia can do it too, but the two are in no other way related. So what you can do is what I said. You can estimate the hazard ratio for all of these diseases before adjusting for hemoglobin. I also did MCV, but for what we're talking about, it's the hemoglobin that's relevant. And then you can look at it with it adjusted or conditioned on hemoglobin, which if anemia is involved, should make the hazard ratio go way down. And you can see all of the orange are the circulatory diseases, the yellow are the lower respiratory, and some of these tobacco-related and alcohol-related ones are the purple ones. But look at the red ones and the pink ones. These are following pattern we would expect if anemia is mediating the effect. It's a very nice demonstration. In fact, what are these red dots? Anemia. So low hemoglobin is indeed predicting anemia. And what are the pink ones? They are uterine and menstrual conditions like leiomyoma, which have lots of bleeding, have iron depletion, are predictive also of anemia. So we've shown that low hemoglobin is highly predictive of anemia. RDW seems to predict anemia, but actually hemoglobin is the leading indicator. Once you count for that, RDW tells you very little more about whether a patient's anemic or not once you know the hemoglobin. So all these other cases of risk are not related to anemia at all. And the second thing we can look at is, what about a pharmacogenetic mechanism? What if it's not the disease causing RDW to rise, but the treatment of the disease that causes it to rise? We can imagine RDW, we can think of RDW as being disease-driven, in which case there's an onset. At first, you hardly notice it, or this is sort of a chronic disease situation. And then over time, it progresses, becomes a little more so, and finally, it reaches the point where the symptoms drive the patient to medical encounter, and finally, a diagnosis is made. And after the diagnosis, often there are treatments. In some cases, the treatments are virtually mandatory. But in a treatment-driven model, you go through the same disease progression, but in fact, the disease has no effect on RDW. But after the diagnosis is made, the treatment is given, and bang, up it goes. Now, we know this is true for one case, and that is for HIV. Because in HIV, it's mandated, it wasn't my day, say when that was, but to do the triple therapy, and part of that is a nucleotide reverse transcriptase, nucleotide reverse transcriptase inhibitor. And zidovudine is the father of them all, so it's very commonly given. And zidovudine makes red blood cells get bigger, well known. And in fact, in this paper, they say if you are managing an HIV patient and their MCV begins to get normal, you need to have a conversation with them because they are not adhering to their medication. So it's a well-established relationship. So how do we look at this? Well, one way to look at this is that we calculated hazard ratios, and hazard ratios are based on the RDW that you measure before the patient is diagnosed. So it's really based on this period. Then we also measured these odds ratios, which were your RDW after you had been diagnosed for a disease. And that's this. Now, you might think if it's disease-driven, if this is high, that's going to be high too, because it's all part of a progression. But if it is treatment-driven, you would expect there to be a disconnect. You would have a high odds ratio, but essentially no hazard ratio, because the disease isn't going to cause your RDW to get bigger until you start taking medication for it. And you're not going to get that medication because you have not yet been diagnosed by a doctor. You haven't been diagnosed by the doctor. Your insurance company is not going to pay for it.
I'm not sure I understand why you do first the hazard ratio and then an odds ratio. Why not hazard ratio all along? I'm not sure I understand why an odds ratio.
Because the odds, well, what we're really trying to explain is why an odds ratio might be high. I looked at a lot of patients. Patients with this disease typically have a very high RDW. It's associated with RDW. but we want to know why that is, and so we want to look at the hazard ratio and now compare them and see if it tells us maybe what's going on. And so this is basically the hazard ratios and odds ratios plotted against each other from the earlier pathomes. And what you can see is that for these gray dots, for an awful lot of them, in fact, you do see more or less a rising trend. If the hazard ratio is going up, the odds ratio is going up too. But you can see these kind of stragglers down here. This is, by the way, the hazard ratio for zero effect. So you see these guys just have barely any hazard ratio, even though they have some cases strikingly high odds ratios. Well, if you were to read all these things and stare at them, you would see that these 5 ones here are congenital conditions. So talking about the hazard ratio of getting a congenital condition, I can't deal with it. So I'm just going to ignore those and move on. So we said HIV should be our poster child for a treatment-driven effect. Where is it? Doing very well. Okay? And now if you think all the way back to our chronic pathome, we identified 10 autoimmune conditions as having very high hazard ratios. And where do they fall? So I think we did a little observational study on what happens when patients go on methotrexate or corticosteroids who might give us some very precise information. It may be that these diseases cause high RDW, but, well, actually, no. It's unlikely they would. Otherwise, they would have a hazard ratio. So they probably don't. And that's probably all just sort of an illusion created by their treatment. And of course, diseases like HIV and rheumatoid arthritis are so severe that sort of a protocol that immediately put patients on these treatments. So practically everyone will be under treatment. So in a summary for pathomics, it allows you to visualize relationships of the full spectrum with various factors. I looked at one lab test. Of course, there are plenty more. I think we could look at treatment responses, treatments and things, demographic categories, interdisease relationships. You can just go on and on. It provides useful results, even though the data is individual data are of low quality, and patients are sampled very sparsely and sampled in a happenstance way, not in a planned prospective, plan or every 3 months or something. The estimates you get are practically free of stochastic variation, which means you can forget about p-values because everybody's got one at this point. Remember, the reason why we have p-values is because somebody named Fisher figured out how we could do studies with a minimum number of experimental units so we could save money. And then the data was so shaky when you did that you needed p-values to figure out what was going on. But when you have 2 million patients and 1,000 cases, there are still a lot of issues, but none of them are about random chance. It's assumption-free, so you can discover relationships you didn't suspect. It's cheap if you happen to have access to the data, which somebody has, for some reason, collated and made accurate and regularized, cleaned up. But it can be very slow because of long run times. So I showed you at the beginning this emergency with this drug. Well, I can tell you, by the time I finished doing these analyses, that whole business had been investigated, written up. There'd been an FDA advisory committee. There'd been an academic paper. So the only way to use it in that situation is if we could run these in advance, like make an online atlas of diseases and figure every condition you could think of and have them stored up, and then you could go and astronomers do this now. They photograph everything in the sky, and then you don't get an idea and then point the telescope anymore. You just look at it online and saying there it is. So let's do that too. And then it can yield insights into causal mechanisms. For example, I've shown how to focus on temporal relationships. Gives you a lot of insight. You can use conditioning, largely in a negative way, of ruling things out as being important. involved. And then the visual is, and then if you stare at the clusters in these things long enough, and you kind of get in the groove, you can come up with your own hypothesis. And who can resist it? So, yes. I discovered you can write papers at great length and nobody pays any attention to it. But if you put a cartoon in, people cite it as fact. I think this comes out of medical textbooks. But there's a very simple way to explain an awful lot of what's going on in RDW. That is related to hypoxemia. Hypoxemia, or low oxygen content in the blood, occurs in a lot of diseases like heart failure and cardiopulmonary disease and lower respiratory disease, but also other things you might not think of, like severe epilepsy causes episodes, and sepsis, of course, is almost by definition is you go on mechanical ventilation, so it's clearly involved. But in a lot of cases where you have high hypoxemia, it actually occurs at night. That's when you aren't consciously making yourself breathing. And then it's kind of hard to detect. But the hypoxemia can occur periodically. And when you get to O2 sats of 80% or 60%, the renal cortex will dump out 10, 100, 1,000 times as much erythropoietin. And that'll go and reach the bone medulla. And we know certainly it causes the body to make a lot more red blood cells. And the theory here, for which there is some support, is it may also make somewhat different red blood cells, ones that are a little bigger. It's kind of like there's a factory and you're making things, and all of a sudden there's a rush order, you've got to have them, and they take ones out before they're finished, kind of, and shove them out the door. And these ones, when red blood cells develop, they get smaller. And so the hypothesis is these ones are kind of there. They take them out of the oven before they're baked, and they last a long time. They last for months in the blood. And so as long as these big cells are kicking around, these are sort of the individual blood cohorts formed and then retired, say, 120 days later. And so you see over that interval, RDW will tend to be elevated by them. And that's a nice hypothesis. And wouldn't it be? And so it suggests then a lot of tests that you could do. And if anybody would like some ideas, things to do, I am available. And perhaps you could even develop this into some kind of diagnostic. Target things might be obstructive sleep apnea, venous thrombosis, which doesn't fit that hypoxemia thing. That might be a whole other phenomenon to look into. And that's this interesting question about patients taking opioids, which I understand a lot of people do. If you look at the importation statistics every year versus the US population, it must be that around 5% at any given time, 5% of the people are on opioids, almost all on prescription basis. But if you actually do oximetry studies at night, a lot of these people dip because it inhibits the central pattern generator and they skip breaths and it goes down. So is this important? I don't know, but the first thing to do is ask, is there a way to tell it's happening? And of course, you also, in drug abusers, you're probably going to see a lot of this. Some light reading. And if you're having trouble with that CME question, you can email me. I hope I've covered it. Thank you all for coming. Yes.
Sorry, the one. I really love your last. I really enjoyed your talk, but also the hypothesis slide where you put a kidney there, and I like kidneys.
They are delicious.
But so when people have chronic kidney disease, they have anemia, really, and because they don't build this EPO, they don't make erythropoietin, so you don't have the building of red blood cells. Was there any association in all the data that you found with chronic kidney disease?
Just renal failure. back, and genitourinary, and you see there's only one little line coming from there.
Mhm.
It's this guy, very, very elevated, and that is, oh no, I'm sorry, there are two of them. Acute kidney failure unspecified, and even bigger acute kidney failure with lesion of tubular necrosis.
So it's very high in these two cases.
So it's high before those diagnoses are made.
Oh.
But who knows? They may have had other diagnoses that were pointing that
Right.
direction already. But
Right.
in any event, I think those. See, the degree they're offset to the right reflects how big they are. I think you're talking about, this one and this one. And then let's see for the acute increase patho. Right. Here, again, you have 2 points, and they are acute kidney failure unspecified and acute kidney failure. And
so that precedes the increase in RDW here precedes the diagnosis of, or the claim for diagnosis.
Now that's another thing you could draw is what is like the linear trend prior to getting a diagnosis. And I have done this kind of informally. I know it's true for heart failure that our RDW tends to march up in a couple of years before the diagnosis. I don't remember for kidney, but the incidence pathome is telling you that if today you take a random person and study and get their RDW and it's high, averaged over enough people, you're going to have a higher incidence of kidney failure in the future. So that implies that people who get diagnosed with kidney failure have had high RDW prior to its diagnosis. And you have to look in depth more than to see, are we talking, what is the shape of that Kaplan-Meier curve? Is this really being driven by people with high RDW 2 months before diagnosis or 10 years? It lead you in very different directions.
So do you have any other lab values with your data, like serum creatinine, for example?
I had one chance to ask for what I wanted, and I took it, and I thought, let's not, maybe if I don't ask any more questions, they won't ask any more questions. And so all I had is MCV, hemoglobin, and RDW. What I really wished I had was hematocrit, because there is a strong association here of RDW and polycythemia. And this led me to a theory. I'm prone to this. And this theory is that maybe there are people who for some reason don't make red blood cells at a constant rate, but go through sort of binge erythropoiesis. And when they go through that binge, you see, then they temporarily have a high hematocrit, and it kind of falls again. Or maybe there's something they do that does it. Testosterone is certainly a possibility. And if that happens, if you have routine blood work done, you may never see that high hematocrit, even though it's happening, every so often. But it could be those high hematocrits are what's causing the venous thrombosis and stroke and so forth, and pulmonary embolisms, which are related. And so so it's a very simple thing to test. I had the data, take people with high RDW and then versus low RDW and look for the amount of change in hematocrit that happens after that, or before actually. And is it true that the high RDW people seem to have a very labile hematocrit rather than a normal, stable hematocrit?
So if you ask for more lab value, please also ask for serum creatinine, because this is really the diagnosis of
no way I will ever get one more datum out of it. It was a chance of a life. But yes, there are.
That's
but still, I mean, it's just a question of these companies like HealthCore are basically selling data. So these studies can be done if someone is willing to make up, and they should, because they're putting a lot of resources into putting it all together. It is, if there are legitimate questions that are important there should be funding somewhere to get data like this. I'm sure in the great scheme of things, it's not a lot of money compared to a prospective trial, for example. In the company I worked for, they did one trial where I did the calculation in real dollars. In real dollars, the trial cost more than the Louisiana Purchase. And it wasn't worth as much as the Louisiana Purchase when the results came out. Believe me. Maybe Delaware.
Well, this is really an eye-opening.
It is. It's cool.
It's very cool.
Neat. What's actually nice is I have these on big colored posters, and then I laminate them so you can look at them while you're eating lunch. And it really does take a long time of looking at it. I think the more you look at it, I mean, there's always this kind of subjective, you get lost in the weeds, but I think sometimes, suddenly you make connections. And then, of course, what you should do then is use the same data, figure out ways to test those, not just make cartoons and have everybody say that's how.
That's great.
You probably should wrap it up.
Yeah.
So thank you, Joe.
Thank you.
Thank you.